With all the absolute insanity in the world, I thought it would be nice to talk about something peaceful and wholesome. What better to talk about than J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings? I think there's a reason Tolkien's work has sort of transcended the generations and has really resonated with people around the world. Several reasons. The film adaptation was, in many regards, frankly excellent, from cinematography to acting to scoring to pacing to special effects. But also the themes of the Lord of the Rings are timeless. You know, cutting through so much of the things that today that are just, I think, content. They're made just as consumerist, disposable products. Even the great franchises like Star Wars, sadly, have been reduced to something you can watch and totally forget about. Cutting against all of that is a story that is a modern myth. Tolkien really wanted to create a myth for his people, and he drew from the myths of old. And I think this really shows in his work itself. And of course, you know, it's obvious to everyone at this point. People used to debate this, but it's simply common knowledge. The internet has just provided us the information. Tolkien was a Catholic. What's interesting is he wasn't always a Catholic. His mother was an Anglican, and his mother converted under very difficult circumstances when Tolkien was a boy. And I think she paid some social price for this, because at the time, to become a Catholic in England was a very difficult thing. It was socially looked down upon. It goes back to the English Reformation, when Queen Elizabeth would actually force Catholic priests into hiding. There's things called priest holes in some of the old manor houses in England still, where Catholic priests would have to flee for their lives. That prejudice, that view of the state and who should be in charge of the church, really did last into Tolkien's day. And I think even now I've heard Catholics in England who converted, their parents sort of just thought that they were, you know, perhaps rebelling, and that's why they became a Catholic. Well, Tolkien faced this in his own life. This affected his academic opportunities. And a Tolkien scholar informs us that at one of the prestigious universities in England, people were openly grateful when a Catholic wasn't placed into a certain role, because it was socially acceptable to be negative towards Catholics at the time. Well, why do I say all this? Well, there's been many biographies written on Tolkien's life, but one of the two recent ones I found extremely interesting were by sort of a cultural critic, but really a Tolkien scholar named Dr. Holly Ordway. And this was published under the Word of Fire imprint, but it's called Tolkien's Faith. And this is said to sort of have changed Tolkien scholarship. And Ordway says that Tolkien's faith wasn't just some compartmentalized part of his life, but it affected everything in his life. It was well integrated into every aspect of his life.
His faith, as attested to by his family, his friends, and his own many statements, was really integrated to everything that he did. And as I followed up on that, I started looking for what did his life of faith look like in practice. I started to discover that, in fact, it was really interwoven with everything that he did, including as a writer and as an academic. And it wasn't just a private conviction.
And so to fully understand The Lord of the Rings, you should understand something about Tolkien's faith, which of course was Catholicism. So I just want to give you some specific examples of this, and then I'll give you a book recommendation and leave you on an optimistic note. Tolkien said famously now, in one of his letters, that The Lord of the Rings is a Catholic work. At first unconsciously, but then consciously as he revised it. I think that Tolkien built the world of The Lord of the Rings, of Middle-earth, with very Christian elements. Now, famously, Tolkien hated allegory. So it should not be seen, it should not be thought that The Lord of the Rings is a Christian allegory, or an allegory really for anything. He despised that. However, what Tolkien did was so much more interesting. He saw God as the primary creator and himself as a sub-creator, and he created because he was designed to do so by his creator. He created this world called Middle-earth, but he built it out of elements that were deeply and profoundly influenced by a Christian worldview, specifically a Catholic worldview. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. This is from one of his letters he wrote to Deborah Webster in 1958. He said, "I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories." In other words, the stories that he wrote, he says you can deduce that I'm a Christian because of the stories the way I wrote these things. And in fact, I am a Roman Catholic. The latter fact perhaps cannot be deduced, though one critic by letter asserted that the invocations of Elibereth and the character of Galadriel, as directly described or through the words of Gimli and Sam, were clearly related to Catholic devotion to Mary. And I think once you see this, you really can't unsee it. Galadriel has certain Mary in Christianity until the modern world, and still in Catholicism, is sort of the feminine ideal. And yet you see this feminine yet extremely powerful and wise character in The Lord of the Rings in Galadriel. Another saw in way bread, or the limbrus bread that they eat, the elven bread they eat on the way to Mordor, the reference to its feeding the will and being more potent when fasting, a derivation from the Eucharist. This food that sort of fills you up longer than it should on, just thinking naturally about it. There are lots of instances of this, but I think this goes very deeply into the entire world of Middle-earth, whereas so many modern films and stories really focus on, postmodern ideology or sort of trying to reconstrue all power structures and institutions as being oppressive, and it's almost, it's a very different emphasis. Often in these things, it's taken that there is no meaning, or that meaning is very subjective, and yet even in those postmodern stories, they still try to find meaning in standing up against oppression. Tolkien just owns the fact that he thinks virtue and beauty and morality and justice and all these things are very objective, and he ingrains these deeply at the deepest molecular level into Middle-earth. Tolkien is not naive about the real evil in the world because he faced it as a young man, and he watched his country face it again, the world face it again, in his adulthood. Now he says when he was in the battlefield, I think out on a watch somewhere, which, I was in the U.S. Marine Corps. I've spent my fair time not in direct combat, but training for it, and certainly having, standing watch. He would look at the night sky and find some inspiration with the even star, which he later actually relates to Mary, believe it or not. This is more influence of Catholicism on the way he sees the world. But this was a light in the darkness that brought him hope in a difficult time. And I think he's very careful to find that balance between being realistic about the evil in the world, but also reminding us that we're not without hope. There's always light, even in dark spaces.
Let him go, you filth.
And then I think perhaps the most Christian thing of all is that the world gets so bad and so dark and so hopeless. And when our heroes themselves fail, goodness still wins. Tolkien called this the UK Catastrophe. This is, of course, borrowed from the word, the Christian word Eucharist, the Thanksgiving meal. But this UK Catastrophe is something like an unexpected good ending, and it's the happiest possible of all endings, even though just moments before the world seemed utterly hopeless. I think this is a proper Christian worldview. The world has seen time and time again terrible days, terrible things, terrible events, just unspeakable evil. And I think we should be very realistic about that. In my own life, I've sat beside the bed of dying people, trying to give comfort. I've lost a lot of friends to suicide. I've listened to people as they have to vent about the abuse they've suffered. And of course, looking around the world, we see that amplified times billions. We see terrible wars and suffering. And even in all that, and no matter what the world has gone through and might go through in the future, as a Christian, I have faith, as Tolkien did, that there will be the happiest of all endings. And we can be a part of making the world right again through the grace of God. The King's going to return, if you will. So a couple of book recommendations for you, and you can learn about this and many other things in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. This collects many of his letters. In fact, they just discovered some more. Hopefully those will be published too. But also, just a fantastic book, it's almost impossible to put down, is by a Tolkien scholar, Holly Ordway. And this is a beautiful book, it's beautiful bound. I don't make any money from this, but I just want to highly recommend that you buy it. If you want to know more about Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, how his faith influenced him, or even about Catholicism, this book is just spectacular. Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography by Holly Ordway. I'll link it in the description. Please know I'm not making money from this, but it might be a help to her and it might be a help to you. Hey, whatever you're going through, whoever you are, I hope you know, with all seriousness, that your life matters very much. There are people somewhere who love you and look up to you. So remember that dark days pass, and just like Tolkien tried so hard to remind us, no matter what you go through, no matter how dark things get, there's always light. And in the end, goodness wins. So try to keep that in mind. So stand for what's right with your feet on the ground, show grace to other people, do things with your time worth doing, and take care of yourself, and be the hero in this epic journey we're called to be a part of. As always, I thank you so much for watching. Take care. God bless.